Hey everyone, this is Justin from Who Is Like You Ministries, and welcome back to another video. This video, I thought I would do a small mini-series on who wrote the Bible and when. This week I'm going to be going over who wrote the Torah, or the Pentateuch, that is the first 5 books of Moses. Throughout the video, I'll be discussing different theories on authorship. Now, as you all may know, Moses is traditionally considered the author of the entire Torah. So I'll explore that theory, and then I'll also talk about some other interesting theories as well that have come up throughout the centuries, and some even as late as the early 1800s, and then persisted all the way until the 1900s. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, we'll talk about Genesis. Now, Genesis in the pages doesn't specifically say who wrote the book. Traditionally, it's been attributed to Moses writing around the 15th or 13th centuries, depending on how you date the Exodus, with the early dating or the late dating. And we know that traditionally the other books of the Torah are attributed to Moses, and Genesis came with the other books as a single unit, which lends evidence to the traditional theory that Moses is the one who wrote Genesis. There are other theories, however, on who could have written the book of Genesis. It could have been someone during the time of King David or King Solomon, approximately the 11th and 10th centuries BC. It also could have been during the time of Josiah, the king, during the 7th century, or during the time of Ezra, when they're rebuilding the wall and the temple during the 5th century BC. Now, another interesting theory is called the JEDP theory, and this one's going to come up with all of the books. It's one that emerged in the 1800s and really was extremely popular up until the 20th century. And the JEPD stands for Yahwist, the J, or Jehovah. The E stands for Elohist, a name for Elohim, which means basically God, a name for God. The D stands for Deuteronomist, and the P stands for priestly. The Yahwist, the J, represents a 9th century BC document that arose in Judah. The Elohist source was theoretically composed around the 8th century BC in Israel. The Deuteronomist source was written around 621 BC, and it lends support to King Josiah's reforms. And the priestly source, the P, was supposedly written circa 500 BC by a group of priests wanting to preserve their own history of Israel. All of these sources were supposedly compiled around the 5th century BC. This theory was popularized by 2 people, K.H. Groff and Julius Wellhausen. As far as theories go, this one is not widely accepted by scholars, but it does have a significant following. Another interesting theory states that there are actually 10 authors of Genesis, and this theory is held by people like Dr. Kent Hovind, and the theory says that Moses just compiled all of the writings from those 10 authors. You can see the evidence that people draw for this theory using what's called the Toledot formula. And Toledot in Hebrew means generations. So every time in the book of Genesis you would see, now these are the generations of Shem, these are the generations of Noah, these are the generations of Adam. Every time it says that, it'll switch to a new author. So, for example, Genesis chapter 1 was written by God. Genesis chapters 2, 3, and 4 were written by Adam. Genesis chapter 5 and part of 6 was written by Noah. The rest of 6, 7, 8, and 9 were written by Noah's sons collectively. And then just Shem wrote chapters 10 and 11. Terah, Abraham's father, wrote chapters 12 through 24 of Genesis. Ishmael wrote part of chapter 25, and Isaac wrote the rest of that chapter all the way through 35. And then Esau wrote chapter 36, and then Joseph wrote 37 through 50. This theory does have some support in that many stories were written down before the time of Moses, and it's not hard to imagine that Moses compiled everything and then wrote it all down under the divine guidance of God. The second book in the Torah is Exodus. Traditionally, by Christians and Jews, it was written by Moses, during the 15th or 13th centuries BC, depending on how you date the book. When examining the text more closely, it can be confirmed that Moses wrote at least 4 parts of Exodus. And these 4 sections were the war with the Amalekites in chapter 17, verses 18 through 16, the covenant code from chapter 19, verses 1 through 24, chapter 24:4, and chapter 34:27. The Song of the Sea is the next part from chapter 15, verses 1 through 21. And the last section that Moses for sure wrote was the additional covenant stipulations from chapters 34, verse 1 through 28. Some scholars even say that Moses wrote most of Exodus with later editors adding to it. Joshua, Moses' successor, is also thought to have written the book of Exodus. And along with Joshua, Eleazar the priest is someone who is possibly thought to have written the book. This is based on some oral traditions that have been passed down from Moses and Aaron. The JEDP theory that I discussed is also a contender for authorship. In this theory, Exodus 1 through 34 is regarded as a splicing of the Yahwist, Elohist, and priestly sources. And then 35 through 40 is just solely from the priestly source. Also, the extensive third-person narratives in the book of Exodus, including the lauding of Moses from 11:3, along with parenthetical insertions intended to bring a later audience up to date on the information. For example, in chapter 16, 31 through 36, suggests that someone other than Moses may have written Exodus in its present form. And this present form could have been by Joshua, Moses' protege. We do speculate that Exodus was probably cast in a unified 5-volume book that was compiled sometime between the days of Joshua and the elders of Israel and the era of Samuel. Next is Leviticus. Orthodox Jewish and Christian scholars again attribute authorship to Moses during 1400 BC or 1200 BC, depending on when you date the Exodus. The phrase, "the Lord said to Moses," occurs more than 25 times throughout the book, which lends weight to the idea of Mosaic authorship. Moses is explicitly and repeatedly cited as the recipient of Adonai's commandments, and everywhere the book assumes a desert context. The numerous Mesopotamian legal parallels to Leviticus also support an early dating for the book. Ezekiel's extensive appeal to the legislation of Leviticus shows that it at least predates the Babylonian exile. Also, when examining the text, much of the legislation is ill-suited for the civil and ceremonial context of the post-exilic, that is, after the Babylonian exile, Hebrew community. The JEDP theory also applies to Leviticus. In this theory, it was written by Levitical priests between the times of 550 BC and 450 BC. There is a third position which lingers in between Mosaic authorship and the JEDP theory, which is also called the documentary hypothesis, by the way. In this view, the priestly source is pre-exilic, meaning before the Babylonian exile in 587 BC in date, but not Mosaic in origin. People who affirm this dating for the book of Leviticus pull evidence from the fact that the teachings in Leviticus are similar to the books of Judges and Samuel on topics like personal holiness, warfare, and blood sacrifice. Next is the book of Numbers. And as with the first books that we talked about, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, traditional Christians and Jews attribute authorship to Moses, having been written around the same time as the other books in the 15th or 13th centuries, depending on how you date the Exodus. However, Numbers has only one reference to Mosaic authorship in the entire book in chapter 33, verse 2. Priests are also thought to have preserved the book, specifically referring to their priestly duties around the tabernacle. As with Leviticus, though, the phrase, "and the Lord said to Moses," appears in every chapter of the book. This lends great weight to the possibility of Mosaic authorship. For the documentary hypothesis, or the JEDP theory, Numbers 1 through 10 is thought to have been written by the priests, and 11 through 36 is attributed to the Yahwist and the Elohist, with some portions written by the priest. Portions of 11 through 14 and 16 and 20 through 25 are written by the Yahwist and the Elohist, and portions of 13 through 17, 20, and all of 25 through 36 were written by the priest. According to this theory, Numbers underwent many revisions and additions until it ended up in its current form in the 5th century BC by the priestly editors. The references to Moses in the third person in places like Numbers 12:3 and 15:22 through 23, and the editorial insertions in 13:11, 22, 27:14, and 31:53 that are designed to update a later audience suggests that the book's final form was completed after Moses' death. The extensive portions of the history and the legislations of Numbers are thought to have originated with Moses during the 38-year desert wandering. It is unknown whether he transcribed the words himself or he dictated to a scribe. We do know that, like I mentioned in Genesis, Numbers was part of a unified 5-volume book that was compiled sometime between Joshua and Samuel. Lastly, we've got the book of Deuteronomy. There are 2 competing theories on the dating of Deuteronomy. These are the documentary hypothesis, the JEDP theory, and the theory of Deuteronomistic history. Both of these models have dated Deuteronomy to the late 7th century BC and cited it as the foundation for King Josiah's reforms around 622 BC. And you can find this in 2 Kings 23. One reason for not accepting Mosaic authorship for the book of Deuteronomy is that the book teaches that worship should be centralized to one sanctuary in Deuteronomy 12. This centralization could not have been an issue prior to when the temple was built. There's also no historical evidence to substantiate a claim that Israel was concerned with centralization until the time of Josiah, or possibly a little earlier with Hezekiah. Scholars in favor of this dating contend that the warning about kingship found in chapter 17 must have originated after the foundation of the monarchy. However, Deuteronomy contains a lot of material that is considerably earlier than the 7th century BC. These arguments beg the question to the extent that they deny Moses logically anticipated the issues that would need to be addressed. There is, in fact, no reason to deny that Deuteronomy is, in fact, an accurate record of the words of Moses. Now, Moses may not have written the words down, but the nature of the material in the book, along with its unity, suggests that it was written very close to the time that Moses gave the actual speeches. Moses is credited with at least some of the writing due to him being the dominant principal and determinative voice of the book. A few sections, however, like chapter 34, may have been added at a later time. Now, I think this evidence is really fascinating. The unity of Deuteronomy is evidenced by the fact that it has the same structure of a Near Eastern vassal treaty. More than 50 of these treaties have been discovered in the ancient Near East, ranging from the mid-3rd millennium BC to the mid-1st millennium BC. And nearly half of these treaties are from the Hittite Empire in the mid-2nd millennium BC. Many studies show that each period has its own characteristic outlines for giving the terms of a treaty. With this in mind, it has been argued that Deuteronomy follows the format of the mid-2nd millennium BC treaties when compared with the other time periods, thus demonstrating that the book of Deuteronomy can be dated to the time of Moses. Now, the Pentateuch as a whole has another dating hypothesis that was created by R.N. Wybray. He argued that the Torah is a unitary composition that was written in the 4th century BC and modeled after the Greek histories by Herodotus. Other evidences in support of Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch include the fact that even Jesus and the New Testament authors attributed Mosaic authorship to the Torah. This can be seen in places like Matthew 19:8, John 5:46 and 47, 7:19, Acts 3:22, and Romans 10:5. Also, the forms of names and many actions of the patriarchs make the most sense around the 2nd millennium BC environment. The narrative suggests a thorough association with Egypt. Egyptian loanwords, which are words adopted from one language into another language with no modification, appear with greater frequency in the Torah than any other part of the entire Hebrew Bible. The name of Moses itself suggests an Egyptian setting for the story. The general viewpoint of the narrative itself is foreign to Canaan. The seasons are Egyptian, and the flora and fauna as well are Egyptian and Sinaitic. In some instances, the geography reflects a foreign viewpoint. For example, a comment like Genesis 33:18, where it reads, "The Canaanite city of Shechem is unlikely after the exile, because by then Israel had been in the land for 900 years. And also various archaisms in the language, such as the use of the third-person singular pronoun he for both genders. These are all pieces of evidence in favor of Mosaic authorship. Also, the Jews throughout their entire history in every sect, every group, have always attributed authorship to Moses. And you can find various examples in the Tanakh of Mosaic authorship, like Joshua 8:31 and 32, 1 Kings 2:3, Jeremiah 7:22, Ezra 6:18, Nehemiah 8:1, and Malachi 4:4. From the time of Joshua all the way till Ezra, there is constant reference to the Torah as, quote, the law of Moses. Jewish oral law also ascribes authorship of the written Torah to Moses. For example, in Pirkei Avot, which is a book in the Mishnah, in chapter 1, verse 1, the very first verse in that book, it reads, "Moses received the Torah at Sinai." As we can see, there are many theories on who wrote the Torah, who wrote specific books, when each thing was written. I personally hold to the traditional view that Moses wrote all of the Torah, and in the parts of Genesis, it's not unheard of that he would have compiled already written down material. I don't think that's a problem. There are other views like the documentary hypothesis, the JEDP, which suggests that 4 different sources wrote and compiled the Torah, the Pentateuch, throughout the histories. And then you also have the theory of Deuteronomistic history. And there are tons of other theories as to who wrote the Pentateuch. These are just some of the main ones. You all can do the research yourself and figure out which theory you specifically fall under. Most scholars will assert that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and I'm in agreement with that. If you all enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like down below and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and have a great day.